Thanks for joining us for the second part of our interview with Robert Perry, editor of consortiumnews.com. Thanks for joining us, Bob.
Thank you.
So in the first segment of the interview, we talked about the Johnson tape, and just to remind people, we'll play just a few more seconds of that.
I know this, that they're contacting a foreign power in the middle of a war.
That's a mistake.
And it's a damn bad mistake.
Oh, it is.
And I don't want to say so. And you're the only man that I have enough confidence in to tell them. But you better tell them they better quit playing with it. And the day after the election, I'll sit down with all of you and try to work it out and be helpful.
So in this tape, Johnson talks about Nixon committing what amounts to, in his opinion, treason. And the media today, as we said in the first segment, did very little. This wasn't much of a story. But you're saying this kind of covering up or not wanting to expose the real inside of U.S. geopolitics goes on. So talk about the next episode.
Well, you see it in 1980, where there has been now a great deal of evidence that has built up over the years from both Iranians, from people in Europe, from various intelligence operatives from Israel and other countries, who have described their interference with Jimmy Carter's hostage talks in the 1980 elections when he was trying to free 52 Americans who were held hostage in Iran. This was an operation that involved some people who were tied to the Reagan-Bush campaign, including some senior people, some of whom are still in the news today. But this has never been resolved. There's always been this desire of not going too far there. And it's easier to say, let's sweep it under the rug. Let's not raise these doubts about the legitimacy of the government and how these people in power work. It's easier to say, just don't go there. And we saw this in the 1968 case, where even to this day, people don't want to talk about what Nixon may have done in any serious way in the Washington press corps. We saw this in 1980, the stories there, which was kind of a prequel to the Iran-Contra scandal. The Iran-Contra scandal was sort of a later phase of these early contacts. And so you have this history that's sort of murky. No one quite knows what's really behind it. There's a lot of evidence, but it's never given the attention that it deserves.
Talk a little bit about the lead up to the Iraq War, because a lot of people have said it's more or less the same kind of story in terms of the way the media has treated what we know now and the kind of mythology that's being created now. On Sunday morning, just past, you have Bill Kristol talking about George Bush became a war president, even though he expected to be more focused on domestic policy. But he became a war president, and Kristol adds, and a pretty good one, I'd say. And everyone at the table nodded their head, which, although it was Fox, there's people around that table that are not just normal Fox, yes.
Well, I think that's true too. We're seeing now a recreation of some of that, where some of the real questionable decisions that Bush made going into that war in 2002 and 2003 are essentially being rewritten or ignored. Bush, in his interview with Charlie Gibson on ABC just the other night, said he's asked about would the war have happened had you gotten the good intelligence that there was no WMD. And he said, well, yes, it would have anyway, because Saddam Hussein was keeping the inspectors out and not allowing them to see whether the resolutions of the UN were being enforced. That's not true. But what happened with that story is interesting. That segment was cut out of what was shown on the evening news and what many Americans saw.
You saw the transcript on the internet.
Right. I read the transcript, and what you see in the transcript is this reference, which actually Bush has used repeatedly, going back to 2003, where he started claiming as early as July of 2003 that Saddam had not let the UN inspectors in. We'd all seen the UN inspectors in. They went in there in the fall of 2002. They drove around in their white vans. Bush forced them to leave in March of 2003, so he could invade the country. But now this new history has sort of taken hold.
That Bush forced the inspectors out. Not Bush, that Saddam forced the inspectors out, and that's why
that he never let them in.
Yeah.
So, and Bush started telling that story, and the press did not challenge him. And it's been repeated and repeated and repeated since. And to the extent that Bush feels in this sort of exit interview, he can repeat it again. And no one's going to really challenge him. And in fact, ABC snips out that very important segment of his response.
Because he wasn't challenged.
I presume because he wasn't challenged then or any time before that, really.
Well, the other thing that's becoming part of the narrative, which also isn't true, which is that everybody thought there were weapons. It was mistaken intelligence. The idea that the intelligence was manipulated is being taken out of history. The fact that within their own camp, within the State Department, their own intelligence people were saying there are no weapons of mass destruction. Blix was telling them there was no weapons of mass destruction. And many other countries' intelligence agencies, including, we know, the Downing Street memo, and the British were saying there were no weapons of mass destruction, but no journalist and corporate media ever challenges any of them when they say, well, everybody thought there were weapons of mass destruction.
Right. It's become the easy way to handle this story. It also allows the Washington Press Corps, which was very much implicated in the bad decisions, the bad judgments to lead into the war, it allows them also to sort of cleanse themselves. They can say, well, see, it really wasn't our fault because we didn't ask the tough questions, but there really were no tough questions to ask because there was just bad intelligence. Who would have been able to go through that? So this changing of history not only helps the politicians, but it helps some of the journalists, some of them, the well-paid journalists on TV and so forth, who really are as guilty in many ways as some of the people in the CIA or in the White House, and who were part of this policy making.
It's a creation of a very complementary mythology. What does it tell us about the new Obama administration? They don't seem to want to pursue any of this.
Well, we're seeing the same thing again, in that there doesn't seem to be any eagerness on the part of people coming in with the Obama administration to dig into the crimes and misjudgments and all the rest of it that was part of this Bush administration. We saw the same thing in '93. When Bill Clinton came in, he did not want to go back and look at the crimes of Reagan and Bush, which would have been very important. That history was, if that had been set right, it would have changed how Americans understood that era. But Clinton felt it was important not to have these partisan feelings. He wanted to be bipartisan as much as possible. He had a recession to handle. He was doing the same kinds of things we're now seeing with Obama. We have a recession to deal with. We don't want to sort of tie ourselves up by going back over this old history. Let bygones be bygones. But while that may seem to make some sense, it actually leads to some very bad things happening in the future. Much like because we did not know Reagan and Bush's history well in the first round, we ended up getting the second Bush. So sometimes knowing your history really helps you from making mistakes in the future.
Of course, the case that gets talked about on the internet probably more than any other is 9/11, which is one of the places where many thousands of people believe journalists have simply not gone, and that the official story simply doesn't satisfy the questions. What do you make of this? What do you make of it, not so much of what you think happened or didn't happen, but what do you make of the way journalists have dealt with the story?
Well, I tend to disagree with the conspiracy theorists. I think basically we know more or less what happened on 9/11. And I think some of the allegations are a little silly, frankly, and not worth much. However, I do think it's fair to say that there should always be more skepticism in going into these kinds of stories. The press should not just sort of go along with what the easy answer is, but to really look for the harder truth that often lies behind these issues. And I think because there are all these other failures that we've talked about, what happened in '68, what happened in 1980, what happened with Iran-Contra, what happened with the Iraq-Gate scandal of arming Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, all these sort of scandals that get sort of swept under the rug, that does lead people, when they see another event like 9/11, to be much more suspicious.
Well, when you see a Richard Nixon purportedly puts off peace talks in order to gain an advantage in the election campaign, and then you come back to 9/11, and if you can imagine that mindset operating there, it does leave you with unanswered questions. And we know that there was a congressional commission that, in their report, blacked out 27 pages of report on the Saudi connection with the bombers. I mean, with the conspirators.
Right.
The LA Times reported that and sticks by the story that 27 pages actually named members of the Saudi royal family that had direct connection with the 9/11 conspirators. We know that Condoleezza Rice, in front of the 9/11 Commission, said that they had tasked the FBI offices based on the bin Laden memo. And then when the lawyers of the 9/11 Commission followed up, they found only 2 of the 72 FBI offices had actually been tasked. So whether some of the accusations coming out are perhaps outlandish, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And it seems to me that this is another case where you have a kind of closing of the ranks of journalists because people just don't know where the answers might lead.
But I always argue that people should follow the facts as best they can. And I'm always suspicious or concerned about conspiracy theories because they end up discrediting what might be the real story, because sometimes they get so far-fetched that people can just laugh at the whole question.
And that may be exactly what's happened on the 9/11 issue. Because if you start with some of the facts, like those 27 pages of Saudi connection, the fact those planes took off, taking Saudis out of the country, we know that's a fact.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We know what Condoleezza Rice said at the 9/11 Commission certainly wasn't a whole truth. It was barely a partial truth in how she responded to the bin Laden memo. There's some facts, at least to start with. But corporate media more or less has dropped that. And when you hear this Nixon tape, you can see what's possible.
Right. And I think the Nixon tape does take you back to this point. And then one of the arguments you always hear is, would they really go that far? Would some politician just forget to get power really go that far? And in this case, clearly someone did. Richard Nixon and his crew did put 500,000 American troops at risk. There were 500,000 American troops on the ground in Vietnam, and obviously many people in Indochina who also suffered during this period. And to win an election, it appears Nixon and his people were willing to play games with that.
Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you for joining us for this interview with Robert Perry.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars and into environmental disaster, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Real hope means facing a complex reality. Your tax-deductible donation makes it possible. Please contribute. Visit therealnews.com.